Well, you made it through the first week, and hopefully at this point you have a better sense of the stage that has been set in the Bible for the story of the first gospel, the wider story of Israel and the world in which it sits. And I expect that you will find the first gospel to breathe new kinds of life and have meaning that you haven't perhaps perceived before, because hopefully now you're able to hear it at least somewhat within this larger drama of God and Israel in the midst of this wider world in which Israel finds itself. As we begin to dive into Matthew now, the challenge, as I said in the introductory video, is to read Matthew as a narrative, to read it as one seamless story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Those of us who have been deeply formed in the evangelical tradition often do not do this very well. We're accustomed to reading the Gospels, if we read them at all, or any of the biblical narratives, in sort of isolated moments. You know, maybe we read one chapter, a 5-minute scene for a daily devotional or a sermon one week, and that scene is kind of boiled down to a timeless lesson or something of that sort. Reading the Gospels that way, 5 minutes at a time, you know, one day, or 5 minutes per day, for example, over the course of a month to get through one gospel, I think is a good way of losing sight, you might say, of what is actually going on in the story. You might compare it to watching a movie. What would happen if we were to watch a movie for 5 minutes at a time, once a day, watch 5 minutes, stop, come back the next day, turn on the next 5 minutes, or maybe even a different part of the movie altogether, and then in the course of a month, get through the entire movie? What kind of understanding of the movie would we have? Would we have perceived the real drama, the subtleties, the development of characters, how important certain places are, the way motifs hold the story together and make claims upon the reader by virtue of how certain things are repeated or subtly changed over the course of the story? All that is missed if you don't read the gospel as one seamless narrative. So that's what I want us to try to do as we dive into the first gospel, is to do our very best to read it as one whole story, and of course to see that story as planted right in the middle of the story of Israel. To that end, I have put right below this recording on Moodle a PDF file that has the whole Gospel of Matthew without any chapter numbers or verse numbers. It just has paragraphs that I have divided, and the whole text of Matthew in the NRSV with some tendentious and very biased modifications by me. The hope is that without some of the distractions that often force arbitrary divisions into our reading of the story, you might be able to track with the story a little bit better and be impressed by certain details, certain connections that you're not accustomed to seeing because you tend to read this in a very fragmented way, at least most of us do. So I hope you'll use that PDF. Obviously you don't have to. My suggestion is to print it off and to use it in whatever way you find helpful, to mark it up, use highlighters, draw lines to connect things, colors to show the relationship between key terms, titles of Jesus, key developments, whatever you can grab hold of to help you hold the story together. You want to try to read the gospel as a whole as a kind of sequence of scenes. Each scene building upon what has come before. Another comparison would maybe be a piece of music. For those of you who are musicians, I know we have several of you in the course. I mean, imagine what notes sound like if they are taken out of the song. The notes sort of acquire their meaning by virtue of their relation to one another, the way that they are woven together, as it were, into a song. Well, it's very similar what's happening in the first gospel. These scenes, even the teaching of Jesus, has been woven together in a very particular way so that it matters at which point Jesus says something. It matters, for example, that the temptation follows directly upon the baptism of Jesus, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Ben and I had a discussion about this online that you might want to check out. So the sense that you make of what Satan is tempting Jesus with depends on what has just happened in the baptism scene, and it depends on what is going to follow subsequently in the story. I often say that the meaning of the individual scenes of the gospel depends much more on how those scenes are between other scenes than it does on anything inside of the scene itself. You can't make sense even of the details inside any one individual scene apart from its relation to the wider sequence of scenes in which it sits. So do your best to try to track with the story as it is unfolding, and I would suggest that you read it as increasingly unfolding for us who Jesus is. The story is a progressive revelation of Jesus, you might say. Each scene adding a new layer, a new dimension, new words that help open our eyes to who Jesus is and thus teach us what it means to be his disciples, and in Matthew, even what it means to be his church, his gathering. So hopefully the PDF that I have will help you make some of these connections, and I'll be very interested to hear from you what has struck you in a way that perhaps it hasn't before, because you've tried to read the story from start to finish as a seamless narrative. I will place some forums up, two I'm thinking at this point. One that I want you to deal with, answer the question of, after you read just the first 17 verses of Matthew, the opening genealogy. In light of how we have been setting the stage for the story, I think it will be helpful to ask what story the genealogy that opens the first gospel is already telling, how it is situating Jesus within the story of Israel. So that will be the first forum. The second forum I'm going to want you to do after you've finished reading the first gospel, thinking about it some, and will hopefully help you tie some of the bigger pieces of the gospel together and get us discussing how the gospel fits together as a whole. So that is what we are up to. I am mindful that we have the first outline, if you choose to do your first outline on Matthew, coming due on Sunday, and so I will be giving you some more details on that in the next couple of days. Frankly, I'm trying to postpone that just a little bit. It's okay for you to get started if you want, but I'm postponing it because I don't want to preempt, you might say, your reading of the story with the demands of that assignment. I'd rather have you read the story of Matthew in a sort of open-ended way and then worry subsequently about how to do the assignment. Check the syllabus on the assignments. You'll see there that I've asked you to write up outlines of 2 of the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you can choose to do this first one, or you can choose to wait and then you'll have to do Mark and Luke. I will also be posting some samples to help guide you in doing this assignment. There obviously is a short sample of a part of Matthew in the guide for how to fulfill that assignment at the end of the syllabus, but I think you could probably use more given some of the limits of our communication through these media online. So that's what's coming. Our main activity for the next 3 days is to read the first gospel with some patience and with some sensibility that has been formed by the story of Israel as it has come to us through Daniel, through First Maccabees, and hopefully illuminated some for you by the lecture that we read for last time. So we will be in touch, and I hope that you find the first gospel engaging. I hope that you find it to be what it is, good news.